So, the next start, okay. And it's a great pleasure to introduce this inaugural lecture by Professor Amelia Lake. Amelia is a dietitian, public health nutritionist, working as a professor of public health and nutrition here at Teesside University. She's also Associate Director of FUSE. Amelia joined us in 2017, which was a great move. And prior to that, she gained her first degree in human nutrition and dietetics at Glasgow Caledonian University, and completed a PhD in longitudinal dietary change at Newcastle, and went on to undertake a postdoctoral position funded by the NIHR in the topic of obesogenic environments. As well as working in the National Health Service, Amelia has held several academic roles, including lecturer in knowledge exchange in public health at Durham University. And Amelia's research interests are focused on the food environment, and her research, which we'll talk about in more detail, involves transdisciplinary collaborations to examine how the food environment interacts with an individual's behaviour. Amelia is a passionate proponent of public engagement. She's shaped policy. She's co-founder of the Northeast Obesogenic Environment Network and chairs the Northeast Obesity Forum. She's currently a Beacon for Public Engagement Fellow. Over her career, she's won a number of awards, including the Association for the Study of Obesity Achiever Award. She's also been awarded Time Warner's Power 50 and given evidence to the House of Commons Science, Technology and Select Committee. She's also on the editorial board of the BMC and British Nutritional Foundation's Nutrition Bulletin. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to Amelia for her talk entitled I'm Loving It.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so lovely to see people in real life, in the room, actually, and meeting some people for the first time that we've only seen on screen. And it's also fantastic to have so many people joining us online as well. Thank you for joining this lecture. I'm looking forward to it, I think. And as Steve's already mentioned, I've had a bit of movement around my career, but let me start with a story. So once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved food and loved travel, and that little girl grew up and went off and did her gap year in India, where she thought, actually, rather than taking up the offer I had in chiropractic college, I was actually more interested in food, and I switched during that gap year and decided to go to Glasgow Caledonian, where as part of my studies I won my first ever research grant, which was from the British Dietetic Association, and it meant that under the guidance of my then supervisor, Dr. Julie Armstrong, I got to go to Indonesia and collect data for my first ever research study, which was kind of the route that I was going to go along. And as Steve mentioned, I've had a number of roles around the Northeast, one of which included my first postdoc, which was for a research study called Life Lacks. And perhaps this headline might help you guess what Life Lacks was about. So that was a study on constipation, and I think that's the headline that I'm most proud of, Boffin Strain for Answers. Decided that I wasn't really going to carve out a niche in constipation, and I decided that I would like to explore obesogenic environments. So I applied for and got an NIHR Post-doctoral Fellowship looking at obesogenic environments. One of the outputs of that was my first and at the moment last book on obesogenic environments, complexities, and we'll come back to complexities. I then had a number of roles, including at Northumbria, and then a number of career breaks. And my first career break was after I had my eldest son David in 2011. And sadly, David died within 15 days of being born. And I also run our charity called the David Ashwell Foundation, raising funds for the rare disease ACD that David had and died of. So after that career break one, I went to Durham, as Steve mentioned, and that was really my first post with FEWS. So I'd been part of FEWS, which is the Centre for Translational Research in Public Health. I've been part of it since it began in 2008, but this was my first formal appointment. So FEWS, for those who don't know, is a unique collaboration across the 5 Northeast universities, and it's around delivering world-class research to improve health and well-being and to reduce inequalities. I then moved on to career break number 2, which is my second son, Auden, who's now 9. And after having Auden, I came back and worked at Point 6, so that's 3 days a week. And I have carried on working 3 days a week. Then another career break in 2015 for Faye. And after that, I came over to Teesside, as Steve mentioned, in 2017 and took up a post as reader. In the summer of 2019, while I was sat in Google in California, I got the email to say that I had got my promotion, and here we are. A bit of a delay because I wasn't willing to do an inaugural lecture whilst also homeschooling 2 children, but we have my inaugural lecture, and I still continue as Associate Director for FEWS. And in 2020, just before lockdown happened, I got awarded one of the Power Part-Timer Awards, which I am really proud of, to be able to hold this role at Point 6. So you're here not to hear about my career path or any stories, you're here to listen to me talk about obesity. So why are we interested in obesity? Well, obesity and overweight are defined as abnormal or excessive fat accumulation that presents a risk to health. And it was first recognised as a public health issue back in 1991. And in those 30 years, there have been around 700 policies that have tried to tackle obesity, and that's just in England. But none of these have effectively or sustainably reduced obesity or health inequalities. So if we just keep that in our mind as we go through. These are figures from the National Child Measurement Programme, which many of you will be aware of. And these figures have moved along quite nicely in a steady line from really 2006. However, we see, because of the impact of COVID and everything that comes along with it, a rather sudden and sharp increase with the last measurement. I should say that measurement was a weighted sample, a smaller sample than normal because of the pandemic situation. But nonetheless, it does highlight that this is an issue that hasn't gone away with COVID and very much requires our attention. The other interesting thing to do with obesity is that it is patterned with inequalities. So again, with children, and focusing again on reception children, we can see that the most deprived children have the highest rates of obesity. So there is a patterning of obesity. We know that obesity causes health inequalities, and there is a pattern of this association. If we move to adults, we can see that the picture isn't so good for adults. These are from the most recent Health Survey for England results from 2019. And again, if we start to look at adult obesity prevalence by deprivation, we see the same pattern as we do with children. So as obesity increases, that is patterned with an increase in deprivation. So we've had obesity around for in excess of 30 years. And really it's just a case of energy balance, isn't it? It's quite simple. Eat less, move more, or is it? Well, actually, if you look at this quote from the World Bank, the complexity of the challenge explains that why at an individual level, it's just so difficult for people to eat less and move more, and why no country has successfully succeeded in reversing this trend in obesity. And the reason why is that it's complex. It's much more than eating less and moving more. There are many factors that influence our energy balance, which is there in the middle of the foresight diagram. Oh, the pointer's gone. Oh, there it is, okay. So these factors include societal influences, they include our individual psychology, it includes food production, a massive topic, food consumption, our biology, our individual activity, but also importantly, those environments that we are in. So at the heart of everything we have us, the individual, but we as individuals are not in bubbles as these people are here. Or maybe we are, actually. With COVID, we are to an extent in bubbles. But we have these individual factors, and these are placed within our social and community networks. And factors such as housing, healthcare, water, sanitation, employment, our living and working conditions, our environments, our education, this massive issue around agriculture and food production, and then all these conditions affect the health of that individual. So in the past, a lot has focused on the individual. So for an individual to change their behaviours despite the fact that this environment that's around them, that they don't necessarily control, contributes to the behaviours that they are making. That's why we talk about obesogenic environments, because we are interested in the environments that affect the behaviours of an individual. And I'd like to talk about 4 different topics within that umbrella of obesogenic environments. So this is an area that I've been working in since before 2006. At this point, I'd like to stress that this is very much about me working with lots of individuals, many of whom are in the room, many of whom are online, and it's very much about team working. And I'm very conscious that in this lecture it's a bit me, when actually it's been very much about partnership working. So I'm sorry that I won't be able to mention everybody's names, but behind each of these topics are teams of people of whom I am one. So first of all, I'd like to talk a bit about the food environment. So our food environment is any opportunity to obtain food. It includes our physical environment, so whatever food was offered out there, our socio-cultural environment, the economic environment, particularly pertinent at the moment, and policy influences. And I think at the moment, with various changes that are happening around Brexit, around levelling up, we've never been more acutely aware of the policy influences on what we eat. And that is both at a micro level, but also at a larger macro level. So this simple act of eating, some of you may already have eaten, others, if my stomach rumbles, you can tell that I've not eaten, some of us are yet to eat. This simple act of eating, which is one of the most basic human behaviours, is actually the most complex in terms of that food we put in our mouth is determined by a series of policy and governance driven decisions. So how do we influence food choice? Well, our food choices are influenced by multiple factors, from what we like to eat through to what's culturally acceptable to eat. And that relationship between our choice and the environment in which we make these choices is widely acknowledged. So we see things coming through from nudging through to choice architecture to conceptualising how that local food environment influences what we as that individual chooses to eat. But let's just think about the context for a moment. So most of our decisions about food are actually automatic rather than reflective, so we make them quickly. We tend to overemphasize the importance of internal characteristics such as knowledge or education, whereas we underemphasize the importance of that wider environment and those wider environmental influences. Education alone does not change behaviour. If it did, we would have got there. And changes in the environment are needed in order to change diet. So these external food cues act both at these micro and macro levels. So if we think about something that we all know, our home food environment, we can all relate to that. a lot of the time when we think about food environments, we think about children and pest or power, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to just briefly mention some work we did quite a long time ago. And it's around, when you look at the literature and you do a literature review, and we find that there was some data to suggest that actually there was a bit of a cohabitation effect. So as men and women moved in together, the men would benefit from that relationship and the women would get less healthy. So there was an interesting pattern, hence the headline. And this piece of work, I was very proud, made it into the New York Times Compendium of Ideas in 2006. I did say it was a long time ago. So thinking beyond home food environments, the school food environment, there has been a lot of talk and news about school food, particularly around COVID and the packages that were delivered to people who weren't at school. So we've talked about this a lot, but we did some work after schools went back, and this was in September 20, and looking at the impact of COVID on the food that was delivered in schools. And it was insightful and interesting, and it just shows how important it is to keep an eye on what is available in school, because it didn't really look like it was meeting the recommendations and the guidance. And at the moment we're partnering with Redcar and Eston School Sport Partnership, I got that out, looking at school catering and school food contracts. So that's really around seeing how that matches. And just this week, Bite Back 2030, which is a youth-led organisation, have been petitioning around making sure that school food does actually match the recommendations, and that was brought up and mentioned in the levelling up agenda. So it's good that we've got a piece of work underway that we can contribute to the evidence around that. So we've talked about home environments, we've talked about school food environments. Another environment is the advertising food environment, and I've been involved as one of a number of co-applicants, co-investigators in the Transport for London junk food ban, and that has been fascinating. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that. What I'm going to talk about is the advertising food environment here in South Tees. So we did some work where the data was collected back in 2018, 2019 around bus shelters in Middlesbrough, and looking to see what was being advertised in those bus shelters. So of the 800 odd bus shelters that we collected data from, almost half of them had adverts that were for food and beverage, and around 35% of those were for unhealthy food or beverages. In most of those food adverts, talking about 98% of them, they used at least one persuasive creative strategy. So for example, that might be using cartoon characters. And a lot of them were found to be of appeal to under 18s. So what this says to us in this piece of work locally is that bus shelter advertising should be considered as part of that wider UK policy deliberation around restricting the advertising of less healthy food marketing. So it's another food environment to think about, and one that probably gets less attention than say many others. And I'm really pleased that one of the co-authors on this paper, Scott Lloyd, is now working on a pre-doctoral local authority fellowship scheme funded by the NIHR, particularly on this, and myself and Emma Boyland, as well as Ashley Adamson, are supporting Scott as he carries on this piece of work. Out of home food environments. So that can mean a range of things. So it can mean sandwich shops, it can mean the cafe that's just outside here, it can mean restaurants. We tend to think of the out of home food environment as the less healthy environment, that row of takeaways and fast food outlets. And they're here, and it's quite difficult using any policy levers to not have them here. People like them, people use them, they're businesses, they should be allowed to exist. But surely there's something that we can do to transform these food offerings to make them a bit healthier. And that was a piece of work that I was involved with, funded by the NIHR School of Public Health Research, with a range of colleagues from Newcastle, from Durham, from Cambridge and from Exeter. And we were really looking to do a range of things around, well, what evidence is there that we can change that food environment? How can we work with the people that work in these environments or that work with these environments? What interventions can we develop? How can we test whether or not these interventions work? And there's a lot of papers, as you can see, a lot of papers out of this, and as well as the papers, there are a number of short films that we prepared that are on the SPHR website, which I do encourage you to go and look at, because it talks about our interventions, which included moving from a 17-hole salt shaker to a 5-hole salt shaker, changing the size of packaging for fish and chips to smaller packaging, thereby reducing portion size, and also offering healthy takeaway masterclasses for business owners. And some of that piloting was done in this area as well as wider in the region. So we've talked about the food environment and how we can change the food environment. One of the levers, if you like, is a policy lever, and that's around healthy planning. So we're very familiar with images like this of what might be called, what my colleague at Newcastle, Tim Townsend, calls the toxic high street. So that will include betting shops, fast food takeaways, tanning shops, and of course the takeaways. While planning and health emerged together in the 19th century around a common concern for the health and well-being of the poorest in society, they somewhat have moved apart, and we almost need a little reminder to bring planning and health back together. And really, they've been working very well together for quite some time now. So it may not necessarily be top of the agenda for many planners. However, it is something that is now in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it's around promoting healthier communities. So that is now something that planners are working towards, and this includes access to healthier food. So back to inequalities, which I mentioned right at the start. So there is this association and relationship between the density of fast food outlets, so my graph up there at the top, and deprivation. So there are going to be more fast food takeaways in areas that are more deprived, and we can also see that on the map. So these are figures from PHE, the most up-to-date figures they have nationally. And we know that about a third of fast food outlets are found in the most deprived areas. And this is something we've known for some time. And these fast food outlets offer delightful offerings like this one, although probably with inflation that will have gone up quite a lot. It won't be costing just under £10 anymore. So generally the food offered by these outlets is less healthy. So I've talked about national figures, and this is Fatima, who's in the room. This is Fatima's work for her thesis. And it's looking locally, looking in Middlesbrough. We're trying to map on for Year 6 children, trying to map on prevalence of obesity and this patterning of, it's not working, this patterning of fast food outlets as well as other out-of-home food outlets around primary schools. So we can see this patterning, we can see it at a national level, and we can very much see it at a local level. But then COVID came, and everything changed. The important thing with the food environment is that the food environment is fluid. It is constantly changing. And COVID was one of those changes. And during COVID, there was an alliance for outlets to become takeaways. So places that would normally not be permitted to have a use as a takeaway were allowed to be takeaways. And we worked with what was then PHE and now is Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. We worked with them around trying to understand what that meant on the ground and trying to get a handle on how many places were working as takeaways. And we did that work last year. We're just rerunning some of that work again this year as that alliance comes to an end in March 22. We're also interested in existing levers and existing policy mechanisms. So we've been doing a piece of work that only just finished in October around understanding some of the barriers and facilitators to implementing regulatory mechanisms to restrict hot food takeaways. Around that piece of work, what we found was that communication between professionals at a local authority level is really key. They need to be able to know where to find data, need to be able to share data when they're working perhaps on appeals. They need to understand the evidence and the importance of health. It's really important to have good up-to-date systems. And we need to build and work together with staff who are enthusiastic about this topic. So we know that planning and health need to work together to reunite and to address the issue of a healthier food environment. And that is really key to enabling everyone to be able to access healthy food environments and to be able to tackle overweight and obesity. And some of the ways we do that is by working with our colleagues at PHE, now OHID, and providing practitioners with tools that they can use. So this was something that we worked on in 2020 to give staff in local authorities an actual toolkit of what they can do to promote healthy weight and healthy environments. More recently, we have developed a online training session, which is coming soon. It is with our colleagues at OHID, and it's something that people who work in planning and people who work in public health can sit in their office and receive training with a specific focus around food environments that will be helpful, hopefully, in them changing their local food environment in their areas. So in terms of healthy planning, there is so much work to be done. We've had the Levelling Up agenda this week. We do need more details from that, but we need to better understand all the policy levers that can be used around supplementary planning documents and local plans. We need to work with food businesses, so we are not anti-business. We're interested in how we can work with businesses to make the food that they offer healthier. We need to think about how teams at a local authority level, as well as in the voluntary sector, can work better together. We need to focus on reviving our high street and creating healthy high streets for everyone. And we also need to think beyond the high street. So again, COVID has accelerated this. It was happening before COVID, but this concept of dark kitchens. So a dark kitchen is somewhere where food is prepared, but it's not customer facing. So they typically deliver or create food that is just for delivery. So we need to keep changing and challenging that food system at a local level, because that food system is constantly changing at local, at national and at international levels. I'm going to move away from food environments and planning to talk a little bit about energy drinks. So back when myself and Shalina were both at Durham, we were approached by communities and also the Alcohol and Drug Service to help inform them around energy drinks and young people, particularly primary school age children. So we did what all good academics do, we did a review of the evidence, and we found that there was an association between energy drink consumption and poor health outcomes in children. So just to clarify what an energy drink is, an energy drink tends to be is a caffeinated drink, usually greater than 150 milligrams per litre of caffeine. So it's usually got about the equivalent of 2 shots of an espresso, and most of them have sugar, but there are sugar-free versions available. They come in a range of sizes, and what we were noticing, and what parents, teachers, community groups and drug and alcohol services were saying to us, were that they were being consumed more and more by children and young people, so primary school age children, as opposed to what you might think adolescents. So as well as doing our evidence review, we also spoke to these children and young people, and this included from year 6 right up to year 9. And they were telling us that they were cheaper to buy than water. You could get 4 for £1. You could get them everywhere. And in our work, we did some walking surveys with the children and young people, with them as researchers, and found that that was the case, that corner shops, convenience stores, on their way to school, it was readily available. What we saw from that then is, at the same time as our evidence came out, Jamie Oliver's team also were getting interested in this topic, and we worked very closely in a partnership with us presenting our academic evidence and their campaigning, and we found out that there was going to be a science and technology committee on this topic. So in 2018, not long after I'd come to Teesside, we had to prepare our written evidence to present to the committee, and also give oral evidence. So you can tell it's pre-COVID because we were there in person. And that was alongside colleagues from the Royal College of Paediatrics, colleagues from some of the education unions, and also other dietetic colleagues representing the BDA. And what happened was that it went into a green paper back in July 2019, and not much else has happened. What's interesting is that this week there is a new paper which was commissioned by Department of Health, an evidence review, that tells us that there has been that what we found in our review in 2016 carries on. We have at least a third of children and young people still consuming these energy drinks. This consumption is associated with poorer health outcomes. It's particularly marked in more deprived children and young people. Boys drink more than girls, and frequent consumption is linked to poorer mental health, physical health, and worse academic performance. So there is still no government ban on the sale of these to children and young people. It says clearly on the cans, not suitable for children and young people, and yet these drinks are still marketed to children and young people, and they can purchase them. So this is interesting, and it's something that we will continue to be providing evidence to our policymakers, and also looking to our partners to push this topic. And interestingly, February is Fizz-Free February, so Sustain run the Sugar Smart campaign, and this month is around reducing our intake of pop. So energy drinks are the one bit of the soft drink market that has continued to grow. The rest of the soft drink, sugar sweetened beverage market is in decline, but that is the one sector that has continued to grow, and we need to address this. And this is some of the information that our study produced for not only children and young people, but also for their parents. And there's lots more to talk about that, as it's a fascinating topic. The final bit of my lecture, I'd like to touch on work that we are doing around food insecurity. So it can't have escaped anybody's notice that food insecurity is a very real and lived experience. Although I heard yesterday in Parliament there were some people saying that actually it's not as bad as we think. But from somebody that lives in this part of the world, we know it is bad. We know it is affecting people. Also this week, the Food Foundation have released new data, and they've looked at the increase in food insecurity. So it's risen from 7.3% of UK households in July up to 8.8% of households. So that's 4.7 million adults in the past month. And in my opinion, that's 4.7 million too many adults that are experiencing food insecurity. So it needs to be central to levelling up. We've talked about levelling up non-stop for the last few weeks. And the fact that there's hungry people and children needs to be at the centre of that agenda. We also know that people on universal credit, again from the Food Foundation data, are 5 times more likely to have experienced food insecurity in the past 6 months. And these headlines are everywhere, and embarrassingly, they're even headlines in other countries. And we know that inflation's rising. We also know that the boss of Tesco has said that the worst is yet to come. So this is an important area. It's tied into food environment, it's tied into obesity, because as I've mentioned before, deprivation and obesity are linked. Health inequalities are very real and we can't ignore them. And again, back to Fatima's work, these conversations are happening. These conversations were happening pre-COVID because this was an issue before COVID. And I'm not even going to begin to try and explain Fatima's diagram, but this is Fatima's analysis of Twitter conversations around food poverty. So we've done work at time points before, just before and then during the COVID crisis to look at these conversations around food insecurity on Twitter. We have also been looking at the nutritional quality of food parcels provided by food banks. So food banks have been a lifeline to people who are experiencing food insecurity. What we know is that they are not the solution, and ideally we should not have a country where we are needing to provide people with food banks, but we do. And we need to look about how we improve the nutritional quality of the food that is offered, how we tailor those to, say, people who have type 2 diabetes. And that was something that Lucy, who was a master's student in our dietetics degree, explored in this piece of work. So we have food banks, but more and more, and they are growing exponentially in this part of the world as well as across the country, is this concept of a social supermarket. So rather than a food bank, this is where somebody goes and can shop for food. The food that is there is determined by what's been provided to the organisation that runs them. They're generally run by the voluntary sector or in schools, and they provide people with food. They provide people can go and shop and for very low cost and get access to fruit and vegetables. But despite the fact that these are proliferating across our country, we know very little about how they shape access to food, whether or not they're providing healthier food, how people use the food from these social supermarkets. In Middlesbrough, they're called eco shops, which ties in with the sustainability theme. And my colleague Claire O'Malley and colleague Joe Dunn from Middlesbrough Environment City are leading on this piece of work funded by the NIHR North East and North Cumbria ARC. And this is just a picture of one of these social supermarkets in action. Also on the theme of food insecurity is the work that another colleague in the room Joe Smith is leading on alongside Emma Giles, and this is around understanding food insecurity in a particular population who are at risk of food insecurity, and that's individuals who are experiencing severe mental illness. And again, this is being funded by NIHR Research for Patient Benefit, so that work is just starting, and we're hoping that we can make an impact with these pieces of work. So in my whiz through some of the work that we have all been doing together, I hope that I have brought home why we need to challenge our food environment. We need to challenge it at an individual level, we need to challenge it at a local level, nationally and globally. I started with a very similar diagram, looking at the individual in the middle, right through to the global effects. We can't ignore the fact that climate is going to affect our food availability, international trade agreements, right down to what is available in the cafe where we work. So that is why we need to challenge it. We need to be challenging it at this micro level as well as at a macro level. So we have a lot of work to do. I think we'll be busy now for the next few years. What I want to end on is that at the core of what we are doing, it's around communicating, it's around exchanging knowledge, and it's around partnership working. As I emphasised at the start, none of this is done in isolation, none of it is done by one university or one person in a university. It's teams of people from a range of disciplines working together. I am very passionate, as Steve mentioned, about communicating. Sometimes that involves getting dressed as a tomato, but that's, when you're talking to children, that's important, and we've all got to start communicating somewhere. And sometimes that also means communicating with the CMO, Chris Whitty, when he came on a visit to Middlesbrough just pre-pandemic. So there is a lot of work to do, and at the core of challenging is also communicating and talking. And what's wrong with being dressed as a tomato once in a while? I think it's good for one. So as well as communicating and talking, we're all helping and working together to help. So at this point, I just want to say a huge thank you to lots of people that have helped me up, and that will include Ashley Adamson, John Mathers and Andrew Ruggon, all professors at Newcastle, who gave me my first step into research. Tim Townsend, whose name you'll have seen on lots of my slides, who I've worked closely with for a long time. My colleagues Helen, Claire, Joe, Fatima, Emma, and my Fuse team here at Teesside, and Shalina, who I did the energy drink work with, but also my colleagues in local authorities and the partnerships that we do with the voluntary sector. So lovely to have Joe here from Middlesbrough Environment City. A huge thanks to my parents, especially my mum, who has enabled a lot of my travel and ability to be in places. My husband Simon and his tolerance of all our deadlines and frantic working, and my two children. Also, unusually want to say thank you to all the people who have helped with childcare. So my childminders, my friends, some of whom are in the room, who have looked after children when I've got to go and say meet Chris Whitty because it's not a work day. So there's a lot of helping, and I hope that in turn I can help lift other people up, because I think that's part of our role as academics. I'm sure I've missed lots of people out, but thank you to everyone in the room for coming and listening to me today. I am available on Twitter, also on email, although there is quite a backlog on email, but standard. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amelia, for a standing talk and a tour through your prestigious career. It's always impressive to see the amount of work colleagues do. There may be a time for if there are any questions in the room. Colleagues joining us online, I'm sort of reluctant to invite them to send you more emails, but I presume there's an opportunity if there are any questions for people online to.
Yeah, we've got online questions as well on the iPad.
Okay, so are there any questions in the room? And then we'll perhaps go to any online questions.
Okay.
Number, if we start at
I just have a quick question. What do you think about sugar tax?
Okay.
Think it's effective?
Okay, so that's a question from Gibbon around the effectiveness of the sugar tax. So the sugar tax is one of those interventions that we're very pleased to see, and we need to see more of them because they're at that broader level where they are, that wider, the orange governmental level. So they have a huge impact. And there has been evaluation of that to say it is effective. So it's effective because it has forced reformulation. So it has taken the choice away from the individual and changed the environment. So we need to see more of those fiscal type measures. And we're interested in exploring the impact of taxing, say, high sugar, high fat food. So that's a very, very interesting area.
I guess my question is actually when it comes out sugar tax, my thought was why did not based on tax on the pure percentage of sugar instead of the level of the sugar? It seems a compromise of what the tax system could be in terms of the full impact it can deliver rather than pin it down a bit because industry have a bit of a backlash.
Yes, there's industry backlash to everything, Gibbon. So at the moment there's quite a bit of backlash around the advertising and the regulations that we're hoping to see on that. And my colleague Emma Boyland at Liverpool has done some fantastic work around that as well. So yeah, I think there will always be a backlash and there'll always be the need to compromise, but having that sugar levy is fantastic, and I hope that we see more fiscal measures like that because they are very effective and we have the evidence to say that they are effective. Thank you.
Okay, I think there's a question.
Actually, I'm getting scared to share my feelings because as per my perception, usually I'm very less experienced in this field. Basically, I'm a doctor. I'm a first year student in Masters in Public Affairs at University. So others' perception of this, other students' perception might play a negative role for energy drinks because while I was participating in doing my assignment in the library, I was observing that some students are drinking the energy level drink.
Yes.
And the blue drink, I have never seen that drink. And when I was asking them that why they are drinking all together, they were saying me that, you see, this is the energy drink, the blue labeled can. And for your assignment, it might be very helpful. So I think the others' perception play a negative role in case of the drinking the energy drink.
And so that's a question around, the peer perceptions of energy drinks. And while our research didn't focus on university students because they are adults and they can make their choices, we're very concerned about children and younger people who don't necessarily have the life experience to make those choices, and there is a lot of peer pressure to consume those drinks. So yes, definitely.
And another point is I'm also working on the childhood obesity in my recent module program, the leadership management. And in the Middlesbrough Council, I was getting stressed that in case of the food leveling, there are no selected planning there in the Middlesbrough Council.
I think we do have at Middlesbrough level, they are part of our food partnership, and issues around the planning we definitely discuss at our food partnership meeting. So don't be worried that it is covered. We have very good relationships within Middlesbrough, mostly because we have a food partnership, so we do both meet regularly and we all work together regularly. So that's not just the public health teams, but that's wider across the council. Okay, you're welcome. Was it Peter?
It was. Thank you, Amelia. Great lecture and tour de force of all the research you've been involved in and sort of outlining the different components of the food environment. And so I was interested that one of the last slides we talked about communication and policy exchange, as you well expect my interest is. Sort of engaging with policymakers around this. I mean, we've done this through select committees, but as we know that sort of focus and time is limited. So if you would be in that sort of hypothetical elevator pitch with the health minister in a lift for 3 minutes, which part of the food environment would you pitch him to particularly change the policy?
Ooh, the question from Peter is, which part of the food environment would I pitch to Sajid Javid if I got stuck in a lift with him? Right, okay. That is a good one. I think what I would like to emphasise are environments that, there's too many. This is the problem with obesity, it's complex, there isn't one, so you have to just think about using, giving us the ability, making health the priority, so health in all policies, and that needs to trump the need for, economic issues. We need to be thinking about how we promote health, especially in areas that are on that levelling up, target zones. We need that. So what would I focus on? Probably around planning, but I would say that I've been working in that area for quite some time. However, there are around planning, but this issue around tying together food insecurity and the food environment plus sustainability, that all needs to be connected. So I think I'd be going in the lift for quite a long time and not letting him out, Peter.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will say we do have a lot of questions online, so we may have to come back to some of those at another time.
Okay.
But one in particular is, how can we help people or the consumer to understand that the environment plays a big role in influencing their food choices?
How can we help the consumer understand that the environment plays a role in their food choices? I think as consumers we're getting more aware of that, and I think probably we took it for granted, but recently with the hike up of inflation and also issues around lack of food being on shelves, I think as consumers we're getting more aware. The consumers are the ones in control really. If the consumer desires, for example, front of pack labelling, or that's how we get change. Businesses will listen to consumers much more than they will to academics. So yes, there is a lot to be said for people power and the power of the consumer in changing the food that's available to them.
Okay, bear with me a second. How does the national planning policy framework need to be updated to address the increase in fast food delivery through the pandemic? Thoughts on direct marketing?
Yes, no, that's a huge question. So that's a question around how does the national planning policy framework need to be updated to address the rise in delivery and dark kitchens. So there's lots happening with planning policy. There's going to be a lot happening in the next few months, and we need to think about the fact that we are not just flooding high streets with actual physical shops, but this emergence of what we call the dark kitchens. So I suppose there needs to be a lot more agility within the framework, and also a lot of awareness raising. I think it's a lot to do with not just the framework, but how we change practice. So it's back to that knowledge exchange and communication. And probably we need to update the training that we did and include a section around dark kitchens. So yeah. So yes, there's lots to be done on that area.
Hi, it's Andy Haddon from Big River Bakery.
Hi, Andy.
Hi, I don't know if this is an area you work in, so you don't have to answer, of course. My questions around information systems and how has much work been done that you're aware of, or yourself, how to create a food system which incentivizes healthy, affordable, and sustainable purchasing. So how do you, information systems could be a very powerful lever to make that happen.
They could, yeah. So the question's around, so I'm repeating it because
Yes.
I've got the mic on, so for the online, how do we make how do we make information available around promoting a healthy, sustainable food system, so changing the food system?
It's a systems change issue, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's how to merge those issues together so that there's a positive incentive to all players in that environment.
There is, yeah.
And I don't think such a system exists.
No.
We've done a little bit of work on it, but I think that's the most powerful thing, I believe, if we did it.
I think, Andy, with that and around the food systems, I think we need to demonstrate at a local level, locally, how we could change food systems and how we could make information available locally, and we probably have a good natural experiment
Yes.
in here, don't we? around, for example, information on food for eco shops and reusing food. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and those systems haven't been used, or those systems are held by particular retailers, and there isn't a lot of sharing. So I think this is something that we would be keen to explore, and that there is a lot of power in the data. So thank you, Andy.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so perhaps if we just thank Amelia one more time for an excellent talk. I'd love to share the questions with you,
Okay.
colleagues. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you Amelia for that.
Thank you everyone, and thank you to those online as well.